My talk this morning started about a week ago when Lee was talking. Lee was leading us in this really beautiful sit last week. And I was in one of those spaces that was really uncomfortable, super uncomfortable. I think we've all been there. And about halfway through the sit, after Lee helped us ground and come back into our bodies, I had to turn off my video and I just needed to journal. And that was the way I meditated last week when we were in Sangha together. And I thought I would read you a little bit about what was in that journal entry, because it's really what I want to talk about today, which is grief and the avoidance of grief. So last week, at the beginning of Lee's sit, I was avoiding this grief, and then Joy said something about cradling, and I don't remember exactly what it was, but when Joy said that, it allowed something to start to open, and I could begin to look at the grief. And here's how I did that. I see the story, my own relative truth, and I see glimmers of the absolute truth, like it comes in and out of focus. I touch it for a moment and then it's gone. What is underneath the anger? Hurt? And what's underneath the hurt? Feeling different, less than, unimportant. And what's underneath feeling different? Feeling alone, feeling like an afterthought, feeling unimportant. And what's beneath that? Sadness. And what's underneath that? Quiet, solitude, stillness. So obviously there was more to that writing, right? Lots of more personal that I won't go into. But this running away from grief, I mean, I run away from a lot of feelings. And one of the gifts of meditation, I feel like, is that sitting allows me to build a container so that when I get tired of running, when the running becomes too painful or painful enough, that I can stop running and eventually start to look at what's actually here. And so I was so thankful to both Lee and Joy last week, because they didn't even know that they were a part of that journey, and yet they were both so much a part of that journey for me. There's a poem that Rumi wrote called Bird Wings, and he says, "Your grief for what you've lost lifts a mirror up to where you're bravely working. Expecting the worst, you look, and instead, here's the joyful face you've been waiting to see. Your hand opens and closes and opens and closes. If it were always a fist or always stretched open, you would be paralyzed. Your deepest presence is in every small contracting and expanding. The two as beautifully balanced and coordinated as bird wings." So what is grief? What is this contracting and expanding? And where does it come from? One of the ways that I think about grief is that it is a a giving up or an awareness of some sort of perfection. I think of grief as an eventual surrender when I allow myself to feel it. First that's contracting, right? First I contract, and I a lot of times do everything I can to avoid it. And then there's this surrender if I allow myself to see it. So in some ways, grief also feels like the heart breaking. And in that moment, when Lee was leading the sit, that's what it felt like. It felt like if I didn't look at it, then my heart was going to burst. And then by looking at it, by allowing myself to see it, then the heart could break open. And in that opening, there was this relief. There was a moment of freedom. I think of grief as really old. Like I think of it as housed within my body from maybe the time I was in my mother's womb. That it's that old, some pieces of it. And I feel like grief, like any other feeling, gets stored in the body and it gets stuck at times. And that's that feeling of running into a wall. And it can feel, for me, really scary to touch grief. Grief can feel like, for me, the circle of samsara, the circle of just this cycle of suffering over and over again. It can feel like, to me, like a 2-year-old having a tantrum and not wanting to, just not knowing what to do with it. Grief can feel like, to me, like my 6-year-old self being frozen in bed listening to parents fight and not being able to do anything about it. So when new grief arises for me, I'm both here, but I'm also back to that 6-year-old self, and I'm back to that 2-year-old self. And I forget how to be with grief. And it's only through sitting, through getting quiet and still, that I can even learn to look towards it, I think. When I was a teenager, I went to college at first to be an acting major. I was going to be an actor. And I can't remember if I've told this story before, but we did a lot of method acting, what is a lemon like? What does it feel like? And I had this surprisingly weird system that picked up this stuff really easily. I didn't know why, but sucking on a lemon, an imaginary lemon, could somehow make me cry, and that just made absolutely no sense to me. And so it was this amazing training, but no one ever told me what to do with all those feelings once they arose. And so here I was, this 19-year-old with all this stuff going on and not having any clue what to do with it. And I think for me, that's the gift of sitting, is that it gives me a place to find some refuge, this refuge amongst all of us. I mean, where else could it happen that I was going through my own process and Lee and Joy didn't know the gift that they had given me? And that Sangha, right? Here we are in Sangha. And yet I could be alone and together with them with this grief. Some grief is easier to feel. when it doesn't feel so threatening to me. You know, when it's not directly about me. This last week, I was having a conversation with a friend of mine. We've been friends for 30 years probably. And my friend is Black, and we've never talked about race. I don't think we've ever talked about race until a couple of weeks ago, a week and a half ago. And she was telling me a story about her son, who's a teenager. And he was telling her that he wanted to lighten his skin because he didn't want to be as dark as he is. And I could feel that grief, but that grief, it wasn't right about me, right? It wasn't there. It was this grief for my friend and her son and what they were going through. So some grief is easier for me to touch into and feel than other grief. I think the grief that is very hard for me to step into is the grief where I have to actually accept that there's nothing I can really do to make this situation perfect any longer. There's nothing I can do, that there's like a giving up. You know, there's an innocence about being a child, right? That I think of this, I have this picture of like dressing up as Superman or some superhero, Wonder Woman or something, and this feeling of invincibility, of being able to change the world. And for me, I think that grief is this awareness spiritually that I can't do it on my own, that there's just no way to do this on our own. The grief that was hard for me to see this week, when I was thinking about my friend and her son, and I was listening to a book called In My Grandmother's Hands, and it's about healing racialized trauma. And the author was talking about this issue of shades of color, and how it's so something that we might not even be aware of in ourselves, around how much we dislike color in ourselves or other people, and shades of color. And he mentioned something about, you know, applying that to different situations, and something in the way that he said it allowed me to bring it back to my religion. And so my religion is Judaism. Not that I practice it, but when I think about Judaism and what I was covertly taught about my religion, not overtly, but covertly taught about my religion, I can deeply understand why someone wouldn't like the color of their skin, because there was this awareness of, I really don't like my religion. And this pulling away, this shying away, of not wanting to see. And then in a moment, right, that surrender, like seeing. So the question for me always is, how do we individually or collectively get from that place of that 2-year-old tantrum of not wanting to see what is here, or the freeze of not knowing what to do, or the confusion, the delusion of feeling like I can't, there's nothing I can do, or the blame. How do we get from that blame to actually being with the grief? And I do this through inquiry. You know, I guess we all, I think that would be a great, I would learn so much from us talking about how do we get from defense, right? The hindrance or the defense of not wanting to see, right? Aversion, I don't want to see this, to an opening, to this opening of, wow, this really hurts. And so one of those, the ways that I do it is in sitting and asking this question, what is beneath this? What is beneath the anger? And if I were to hand you my anger, what would be beneath that? And then what's beneath that? And what's beneath that? And what's beneath that? And there's no way to make that happen, I don't think. I mean, you can't force it. But I think that in listening to the confusion, even in those questions of, I don't know what is beneath the sadness. I don't know what's beneath the fear. And just letting that be there, even that is getting closer to touching, to allowing the heart to break open. So I go back to this, to Rumi's poem, right? Your hand opens and closes and opens and closes. And if it was always open, it would be paralyzed. Right? If our hearts were always open, we'd be so vulnerable, right? Some of how we manage that is by the opening and the closing. And then how he talks about this contracting and expanding are like beautifully balanced and coordinated as bird wings. So thank you for taking time to listen this morning. And I'll invite us to break into small groups. And I guess the question that I'm interested in exploring is, how do we move from that place of not wanting to see grief to allowing ourselves to see it, to feel it? And perhaps another question, or one that resonates more deeply, is what is your grief today? What is the grief that you carry today?